How to Science Fiction. Welcome to your first lecture of English 179T. So, this is um, some lecture notes on this week's readings, and here we go. All right. So, Sherryl Vint introduces three popular narratives to help set up the arc of thinking through science fiction. Stories that pronounce technological feats and the social innovations they produce is one way to think through the genre of early science fiction that at its center lies a relationship to scientific extrapolation and rationalist thinking. Yet, as emblematic as Joanna Russ's The Female Man is, as an early intervention to that relationship, there is also a pull towards a reconfiguration of the social rather than merely and only technological regimes. In Russ's book, she poses more philosophical and polemical and intertextual threads in her narrative of gendered othering. Of course, this comes from Sherryl Vint's book that we are reading, the first chapter and the fifth chapter. These are notes just on the first chapter. Vint has a great way with a descriptive turn of phrase when it comes to the thematic breakdown of some of the early genre defining texts, such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that for Vint gives the genre its staple quote preoccupations with the limits of scientific understanding and humanity's relationship to created beings. These are secured in the realm of the science rather than in the supernatural, end quote. So science serves as a narrative conceit to permit the circulation of myths. So what might be a reason for that? It could be the contrast or the means to allow for different points of view to emerge or to let another voice pull the reins of the narrative, right? What are these voices that stray from the straight laced, white coated scientist narration allowing for, if not to produce a unique performance of a quote sense of wonder, end quote? How does that link what Vint writes as the aesthetic experience to the sublime? Science fiction is understood as the technological sublime, the sublime being that feeling of awe, but spectacle of the infinite, visible in nature. And of course, in your discussion boards, I'm going to be interested to see how you are seeing examples of the sublime in the readings and films that we'll be doing this quarter. Veering away from the natural world and onto, or at least projecting onto the objects of technology, which in some ways operate as progress narratives, like those of Manifest Destiny and of Western expansionism, that these objects, such as railroads, bridges, factories, and skyscrapers, become these sites of technological feats. And Vint offers that these imaginings that spring from the minds of their technicians, the authors and magicians of these technologies and advancements, ultimately become the thing that overwhelms the imaginations of ordinary men, or those ordinary men who are ultimately building with their labor um, these technological advances, right? So Vint tells us that science fiction participates in both promoting and deflating the myth of technological mastery and transcendence. That if we celebrate these advances, we might also be anticipating those changes. And that these advances also make way, of course, it amplifies the anxieties and fears that we might have about these changes. Can you think of what might be changing now in the moment of the pandemic we're living through and witnessing from different proximities and distances? Another interesting point I hope you will want to take up in the discussion board is the idea that science fiction operates as a means to replace religion as a hegemonic explanatory discourse. What do you think Vint means by replacing religion as the hegemonic explanatory discourse, in the sense that religion often gives us our origin story, but science fiction offer some sort of intervention or alternative to religion as the teller of the grand narrative of origin. So here's when I ask about your perceptions of genre and how to approach science fiction as a genre, or rather, how would an imagined genre analysis look like? So when it comes to accounting for genre, Colson Whitehead's essay manages to give his readerly perception of the genre in his essay, A Psychotronic Childhood, right? So this is the essay we read out of the New Yorker, and it's it's a great way for us to understand genre, right? This essay is good for its function as a ledger of genre, as it points to the things about mostly horror films and magazines that have captured the writer's imagination. So if you're unfamiliar with Colson Whitehead, he's won the National Book Award. He's a Pulitzer Prize nominated. The Nickel Boys, The Underground Railroad. Just an incredible contemporary writer who is narrating his relationship to the genre of horror B movies. Right, his childhood is spent watching B movies late at night. Sometimes, over the course of the weekend with his brother and his parents, right? Um, and then we see the emergence of new technologies by way of the VCR and how the VCR has given Whitehead a chance to really do, to deep dive into the genre of horror. So, he's a well-regarded writer who's revisiting this schlocky genre's golden era. So, what do I mean by schlocky? Schlock. How is he doing this revisitation? For me, this essay is succeeding in the citational histories of horror film. Whitehead is invoking director auteurs and their filmic histories and imbuing uh, these recollections with his own critical biography, which is great, right? I mean, it's great for me, myself, your instructor as a writer, who often cites influences in a way that gives a sense of course, an admiration, but anxiety too. A writer doesn't always want to reveal the centers of influence that give birth to his or their imaginations. And so Colson Whitehead is writing it from the perspective of his New York childhood. How is this history unfolding in his narration of cultural consumption, of his cultural consumption? So, if we were back in the classroom, if we were approaching these texts together, living a non-pandemic lifestyle, coming in and out of conversation like you do on campus with professors and peers alike, I might have assigned a genre analysis of science fiction. We know it as a 20th century invention, that it emerges almost in response to the technological advances of the early part of the century, and then throughout the century. We have the onset of modernity through, of course, railroads, which help bring the country together, right? We have the Eastern Seaboard now connected to the post-gold rush West Coast. There's transportation and increased urbanization. We have the car, the road, air travel. There's, airports. Just as there are medical discoveries like immunization. Then there's war technologies and aerospace innovation, followed by computers and personal computers. Now we're seeing the fruits of social media and the darker side of surveillance technologies. In all of these developments, there's a story of all of it going maybe towards a path, maybe against the collective good. What happens when these technological advances become the villain in our progress narrative? A question possibly to take up, creatively. For all you creative writers, how would you answer for technological advances working against the collective good? Those are some of the best sci-fi speculative fiction narratives that we'll encounter. What are some examples? Actually, in the film we just saw, Sorry to Bother You. What are some examples of technological innovations in Sorry to Bother You? Did you notice them? What were they? What are they? So to end, for Sherryl Vint, sci-fi doesn't necessarily predict the future, but offers mythological language. Where do you see that mythological language in Sorry to Bother You? How might the literalized metaphor be apt here in our thinking of the film's metaphorical power? The story of Sorry to Bother You, right? We have this character, Cassius, who is hustling his way into a telemarketing job. In the telemarketing job, he finds that his success is contingent on the way that he modulates his voice. And through that modulation, his voice gains him access and entry into an upper echelon that allows him to no longer be at the bottom with the other workers, but now is in decision making, um, positions of power. And so as he rises through the ranks of this corporation, he starts to encounter some uncomfortable truths by way of the ways in which the worry free company makes its millions and billions. So I'm assuming I'm not going to do I don't need to do a spoiler alert, do I? We've all seen the movie, and there are um, an equine species of workers that have been created for higher productive output. Um, the horse people, right? You remember the horse people. So the horse people is um, it's a literalized metaphor, right? So I'm hoping that we can see on the discussion board some of your thinking around the literalized metaphorical um, power of the film. So hope I didn't go too quickly here, but here are some questions for you. How is history unfolding in Colson Whitehead's narration of his fandom and consumption of horror genre B movies, right? So we know that he grew up in New York, and how does the historical evolution of New York take place in his own personal narration with his experiences with the genre? In all of these developments, there's a story of all of it going maybe a path against the collective good. What happens when these technological advances become the villain in our progress narratives? And what are some examples of technological innovations you might notice in a story like Sorry to Bother You? For Vint, science fiction, that's what SF stands for, doesn't necessarily predict the future but offers mythological language. Where do you see that mythological language in Sorry to Bother You? How might the literalized metaphor be apt here in our thinking of the film's metaphorical power? All right. That's it. End of lecture 1.